Buenas, bienvenidos a este vídeo de implandivino.net. Vamos a seguir donde lo dejábamos en el taller sobre el regalo del libre albedrío con Clau visualizando. Claudia, ¿qué tal desde Argentina?
Hola Iván, muy bien, muy agradecida por la oportunidad de compartir con vos.
Gracias
este espacio.
por abrir el espacio también, sí. Pues es súper impresionante, ¿no? Lo que hemos tenido que comentar además después, aunque bueno, la práctica se va abriendo poco a poco cada vez más clara, que es lo importante, pero sí, ha sido muy bonito lo que hemos podido comentar también después del anterior, y que por cierto aprovechemos a recordar que aquí en la página, en un plan divino /yo, que se refiere al título que tiene la página A3, que es la de la guía A3, que sería el yo, el alma y todo eso, pues tenemos este apartado del libre albedrío en los materiales para enlazar las cosas. Las transcripciones de los enteras traducidas, por ejemplo, y ya los diversos vídeos para esto que estamos haciendo aquí, que ahora podréis ver si no habéis visto ninguno. Bueno, pues vamos allá y nada, si pasa algo, pues me interrumpes, pero más eso, son un poquito más de media hora que vamos a ver más para terminar la primera sesión y luego comentar quizá un poco, y si hay alguna palabra que quieras añadir porque no se entiende el español de aquí o tenemos que ir al servicio o lo que sea, pero bueno, pero ya si no, pues vamos directos. ¿Te parece?
Sí, ok.
Vamos, a ver qué tal.
To learn those particular things.
All right, so let's start our first point on limiting the free will of others. So we said it may be in harmony with God's love and truth to take actions that limit the expression of free will in other individuals or groups of people.
Yes.
It's a big one.
That's a pretty big one for most people. You see, we even see this happening a lot even with parents with children. They go, oh, but hasn't my child got free will? Yes, your child does have free will. And why aren't you limiting it? Oh, because I thought I had to just let my child do exactly what it wanted whenever it wanted. No. Does God do that with you?
Some people think yes.
Some people think yes, but no, God does not do that with you, ever, in fact. And so we have a responsibility, in fact, as parents, to limit the free will and how our children use their free will. Not and more to do with teaching our children to use their free will in harmony with love and truth.
That's how I think about it in terms of how is God trying to teach me? Then as a parent, how can I teach my child? So not in a punitive way, not in a way that feeds my own addiction, but in a loving way that's going to teach them about the universe through their experience of growing with me.
Yes.
Yeah.
So if we get back to the main point is that we are allowed to limit the free will of other people. However, there are certain requirements that we need to put into place
for us to remain in harmony with God's truth and
for
God's
us
love.
to remain in harmony with God's truth and love, and for our own soul not to be damaged. And in fact, we can grow from the experience of limiting the free will of others if it's expressed in harmony with love and truth. Which is a very hard concept for most people when they first hear it to get around.
Okay, well, let's just talk about some of the minor points about how does God do this with us? How does God limit free will?
Well, firstly, God, if you think about the spheres of the spirit world, they are limitations on the expression of free will of people in the spirit world. So a person in a low sphere can't go to a higher sphere unless they're in a certain condition of love where they can enter that particular sphere. So if you like, the laws that constrain that from occurring is a demonstration of God's limitation that God's placed upon the expression of free will in the spirit world.
Yeah.
Yeah. God doesn't do it because he's afraid of people going into anarchy. Like, can you imagine God up there, sitting up there? Yes, I'm terrified of Peter. Peter just terrifies me. If I let him get away with it, he'll ruin the whole universe. God's created a universe, right, that can't be limited in that way and can't be harmed, in fact, because the laws of God mean there is no anarchy. There might be the illusion of anarchy at times on different planets or whatever, but there is no anarchy in the entire universe. And so God has limitations placed upon the soul. Yeah. In fact, the fact that our soul degrades in its condition, the instant we act out of harmony with love, is a limitation placed upon our free will.
Yes.
Where instantly our soul shrinks and therefore has less power, it has less capacity to carry out its will.
Yeah. Yeah. Makes perfect sense. So then God desires that we learn to express our free will in the same manner he does?
Yes, always. So what God is teaching us, like all good parents, God is trying to teach us how to become good parents and how to become like people that she designed us to be. Free will is an essential part of that. We need to be free in the expression of our will. But it's no good thinking that this free will then means that I can damage your will by my expression of my own. Because now you don't have will. So as soon as I damage your will through the expression of my own will, I am demonstrating that I don't understand the principles of free will.
Yeah.
Right?
However, you might limit my free will
to help you grow into
still be in harmony.
And still be in harmony with God's laws, yes. Yeah. So I might limit your will if your free will is being used in a negative direction, so that I can help you see there is a consequence to free will being used in a negative direction, and that will help your soul to grow if you come to understand that consequence.
So what should form the basis of my decisions to do that? How? Is that according to God's?
Yes. Obviously, we're not talking about our own opinions. Right? So this is what, unfortunately, most people do on earth. They go, they might be of a religious persuasion, or they might be of some political persuasion, or some other kind of thing. And so what they believe is that their beliefs are right and everybody else who doesn't believe that particular thing is wrong. That's not what we're talking about here. Yeah. You can't limit other people's free will based on that opinion.
Yeah.
You can only limit other people's free will based on the opinions of God, not the opinions of your own. And this is where most people do the limiting of free will in a very incorrect direction, because they do it based on their own opinion rather than what they know to be God's.
And so it seems like to me, if I was to now synthesize a few of the things that we've said, if I'm to limit someone else's free will, I have to do it in accordance with God's truth and God's love. But also within myself, there must exist a condition in harmony with those things.
So a condition of love has to exist within yourself. So as soon as I try to limit your free will because I'm angry with you, I'm straight away out of harmony with all of those conditions.
So with a child, even if I'm trying to show them there's a consequence to using their will in disharmony with love.
Yeah, so let's say they took my most precious vase on the top of my ceiling. They climbed up.
Many vases.
They climbed up with my precious vase. I don't actually have any vases. That's why this is a bit of a joke. we climb up, we get the most precious vase, you know, it might be made of diamond even, you know, that made thousands of years ago, some kind of precious thing. And they climb up the chair, they climb up the ladder, and they eventually grab hold of this vase and they throw it on the mantelpiece and it breaks into 1,000 pieces.
That wouldn't work if it was diamond.
Well, yeah. So it breaks into 1,000 pieces, and what's our response as a parent? Now, if it's anger, anything I do now to limit the child's free will is out of harmony with love.
Yeah. But if I want to love my child, I'm going to want to teach them something about it. So,
pero si quiero amar a mi hijo, tengo que hacer.
This is where I'd have to look at how much I really want to love them if I remain angry, wouldn't I?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
We'll talk more in detail about that.
So let's keep going.
Because there's a lot of principles, there's 3 or 4 principles we need to understand about this limiting free will.
Yeah. So the last thing we had there was under some circumstances, action to limit free will of others may be necessary for me to take if I wish to remain in harmony with divine love and divine truth myself.
Yes, let's choose an extreme example of this. Let's say you saw a woman being raped. You were walking down the street at night, late at night, and you saw a woman being raped in the side alley. If you decided to keep walking, you've done a very, very dangerous thing to your own soul.
Yeah.
Right? You need to limit the free will of the rapist somehow. Right? If you were in a state of love, you would choose to limit the free will of the rapist in that situation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's clear. Okay, so what governs how we may limit the free will of others?
Well, the beautiful thing is the laws that govern the usage of free will, which are all based on love and truth, that God has, are exactly the same laws that should govern our usage of the limiting of free will of others. So we're going to limit, once we're at one with God, we're going to limit other people's free will in exactly the same manner that God does. Exactly the same manner. We won't be any different in the way God does.
Okay, so then we've got a big point here about that.
Okay.
So we said organisations, parents or any other person can remain in complete harmony with God's laws while restricting the free will of others, as long as such restrictions of free will are taken in harmony with the principles of divine love and divine truth, and include an emotion of love coming from the organisation or individual who is attempting the restriction, and does not include any act of violence.
Right, that's
So
a pretty
it is.
That's a pretty complicated statement, and the reason why we've written down a lot of these statements is so that people can download the PDF document and read them again and try to understand them at least intellectually. As I say, once you release all the emotions, you automatically start having an understanding of these principles.
Well, it makes sense with the extreme example you gave before. If someone's being raped by a gang of men in the alley, if I've dealt with if I have enough connection with God, or I've released enough of my fear, or some people don't even have to have a connection with God sometimes to naturally act in that situation.
Exactly.
However, if I'm dominated by fear or false beliefs, I might not act at all.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yes. So if we look at this this particular restriction, if you like, placed upon limiting the free will of others, firstly, it has to be done in harmony with divine love and divine truth. So we have to know what God's ideas on the matter are and not our own.
Yeah.
Firstly. So that's quite complex in terms of any idea. Secondly, it has to be in harmony with an emotion inside of us of love. And this is a very important part of this point, is that if I have any other emotion other than love while I'm trying to restrict somebody else's free will, I'm automatically going to damage my soul and theirs, and potentially also the environment.
Because I'm in violence then anyway.
I'm in violence then.
Yeah.
And so it also can't include an act of violence of any. So whenever I'm in fear, whenever I'm in anger and restricting the free will of another person, I am automatically out of harmony with love. Therefore, automatically my soul is degrading in its condition.
Yeah. Okay, so we just had a few notes underneath that. One we've covered pretty well, which is an action of restricting the free will of another may actually be demanded of us if we wish to remain in harmony with divine love and divine truth.
Yeah, maybe if we could say a little more about that, because it's quite important to understand that there are times as parents in particular where parents choose to not restrict the free will of their children under certain circumstances and conditions, not realising that actually they are involved in perpetrating and allowing the child to perpetrate acts of violence towards others. And this is a very, very damaging part for the parent's soul. The parent allowing this behaviour is actually damaging their own soul and the soul of their child. And so it's very important to understand that there are sometimes you have to act to limit the free will of others. And in fact, if you want to remain at one with God, you are going to have to act. Like there's no, it's not like, oh, can I act? Can't I act? There are going to be some.
Y ha dicho, si quieres permanecer en unidad con Dios, en armonía.
Some situations where if you do not act, you will not be able to maintain that position.
And I guess perhaps it's easier for some of us to see in the extreme example of the rape. But when you think about the male child who's allowed to get away with many, many, many things, who may actually grow into the rapist.
Yes.
As a result of different things that they were allowed to do in their childhood or were not corrected through the restriction of their will.
Exactly.
Then it becomes. This is where a lot of us fall down,
a lot of times rapes are directly attributable to the way the mother treated the son. And so therefore, when the son is raping, he's damaging his own soul condition. But unfortunately, the mother's soul condition is also being degraded because of her choice of what she did to the son before he became a rapist.
Yeah, and also many of us wouldn't hesitate to call the police when we see the rape. But how many of us as mothers think very closely about how am I teaching my child about the use of their will in their day-to-day life?
Yes.
And what is the consequence upon my soul, or how does God see this situation?
Yes.
Yeah.
And it seems to become one modern way of bringing up children is almost to give them no rules at all, and to and many of the people I notice who have that believe they're going to bring up lovely children. In the most part, they'll bring up sociopaths. Because at the end of the day, there's not going to be any limitation placed upon the will, and therefore the child is not going to learn how to actually act in harmony with love and truth in any given circumstance or situation.
Because when there's a family situation, it's almost like we create an environment where we can act in harmony with God's laws and love, or we can almost create a bubble where God's laws and love can't reach.
Exactly.
So it's only when the child reaches society that they become more in contact sometimes with the way that God is acting upon the world that we live in.
Yes.
And so I can see from what you're saying how damaging that can be.
Yes.
If we're actually isolating a child from these laws, then wow.
Yeah, it's a very, very damaging thing to do to a child. I see we've met many children in our travels, as you know, who I've said to the parents, look, you're creating a psychopath by what you're doing with this child. And when I say that, I mean it, actually. Yeah. That by the time these children, some of them will be 20 years of age and they'll be raping and murdering if the parents are not careful and they don't change the way they limit the free will of the child.
Yeah. But of course, many times people parent like that because they've experienced a limitation on their will that was without any love and was very punitive.
Yes, and then on top of that, they have not grieved that emotion.
Obviously, yeah.
So what they do is they haven't grieved, and so what they do when they bring up their child, they do the exact opposite of what their parent did. And unfortunately, the exact opposite will create the exact opposite type of person.
Yeah.
So let's say a person who's created as severely by the first parent is severely limited in their free will. They feel quite tight and suppressed. They're going to be quite controlled. And then they decide they're going to not do the same with their own child because they haven't grieved how they've acted with what's happened to them with their parent. So what they then do is they give their child complete latitude to do anything they want. They can go and smack any kid, they can go and smack even the parent, they can hit people, they can do anything, they scream, they can go anywhere they want, they can
leave their toys everywhere.
They can create messes that mum cleans up after and all those kind of things. And in that process, they're actually creating exactly the opposite type of person who has no concept of how their free will can damage another person. And all they are is just selfishly engaged in meeting their own desires and demands, most of which are out of harmony with love. And so how can that person not grow up to become a psychopath?
Yeah. And it's interesting, isn't it? Because, you know, the person who hasn't grieved this very punitive, restricted childhood, really a lot of their parenting is driven because they can't even bear to have an emotion of sadness reflected at them from their child due to some
restriction.
Because they're so afraid of that feeling within themselves.
That's correct. Yeah. And perhaps tomorrow when we give examples, we can come up with examples of how to parent correctly in terms of correcting a child, in terms of limiting their free will in a loving manner that will have a huge benefit to the child and the spirits that are around the child and so forth.
Yeah, I have a feeling that'll be a hot topic for people who are parenting.
Yeah, but there are other hot topics too, you know, such as how do we limit the free will of a rapist or a murderer? How do we go about addressing those particular issues? How do we limit the free will of a person who steals or lies all the time or, you know, speeds all the time or all of these things that are damaging to society at some point? How do we limit the free will of a person who gets drunk all the time and so forth? These are all questions we must resolve as a society, and there are answers to every single question if we apply these principles to every single situation.
It's really learning to love as God loves, isn't it? Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Well, let's talk a bit broader then about organisation.
Yep.
So organisations have a loving purpose when they are established for the benefit of groups of people or individuals as long as they are in harmony with divine love and divine truth.
Yes. So if an organisation is established, any organisation on earth is established, if it's in complete harmony with divine love and divine truth, then that organisation is always going to benefit every single person that it comes in contact with. Now, you notice it has to be in harmony with divine love and divine truth, not natural love and natural truth. Of course, if it's in harmony with natural love and natural truth, it does have some benefit.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, there are many organisations on the planet that are in harmony with natural love and natural truth, and many religions fall under this category, but they are completely in disharmony with divine love and divine truth, some of them, at the same time, on many, many issues, and therefore they are still causing degradation to the planet.
And so you're saying under those circumstances, it may be loving for that organisation to restrict the will of another person?
In what regard?
Well, you're talking about...
If the organisation is an organisation that's in harmony with divine love and divine truth, then yes, this organisation has a responsibility to act the way God would act. By setting itself up as an organisation, it now has a responsibility to act the way God would act so that there's no damage and only growth resulting to the souls connected with the organisation.
Within the organisation,
yeah.
Yeah. And in fact, given some of the things we earlier talked about, they might have to limit the free will of others if they are to remain in harmony with God's love and God's truth.
Exactly. Yeah. So you can have a divine love police force. It's possible.
Yeah.
You can have a divine love political system.
Yeah.
Todo entre comillas. Fuerza policial también debería entre comillas y sistema político del amor divino, todo entre comillas, sí.
It's possible.
Yeah.
You can have a divine love economic system. You can have a divine love religious system. But it has to involve these principles of free will.
And a lot of soul growth, doesn't it?
And a lot of soul growth.
Everyone involved in it. Yeah.
And of course, getting the current Earth situation to a new situation is going to require change, and you can't expect everything to happen perfectly. But of course, you have to start somewhere.
Yeah.
And we can start with the principles.
And it's good to know the principles, isn't it? Because that's we know where we're headed.
Yeah.
It's very revolutionary, isn't it? And I'm sure a lot of people, the more we start to grow, that it's possible to really have this revolution of love, isn't it?
Yes.
Yeah.
Definitely.
Yeah. Okay. All right. However, we've said organisations that have an unloving purpose are automatically out of harmony with God's love and truth.
Yes. So let's say an organisation has a desire to produce arms manufacturers. Well, they're automatically out of harmony with God's love and truth. And therefore, such an organisation, what do you do with it? Like, well, perhaps you need to turn it into an implement manufacturer, like a farm implement manufacturing place, where it has some harmony with divine love and divine truth. Some organisations on the planet have been purposefully designed to be out of harmony with divine love and divine truth. And those kind of organisations do need to make the most changes on the planet if they are going, and also they're responsible for severely responsible for free use of others, using the free will of others, using their tools or equipment in a negative and damaging manner. So actually arms manufacturers, for example, bear a very large responsibility for wars and a very large responsibility for murdering people. So
it's mind-blowing, really, isn't it, to think of the
en masse,
flow-on effects.
En masse. And so therefore the arms manufacturers, when they pass into the spirit world, are even darker than the murderers who used their arms to destroy other people.
So they could be the owner of the factory, could be a God-fearing man who goes to church every Sunday.
And this is often the case in this. Well, the 5 biggest arms manufacturers of the world are also the 5 that are on the Security Council of the United Nations. And every one of those arms manufacturers, they're all countries, every one of them bear a large responsibility for the way arms are used on the planet. And therefore, they are worse than the person who used their arms to murder other people. And this is where, obviously, and this is what I was saying earlier, when I take an action that affects thousands of people, then my soul condition is going to degrade very rapidly if the action I take is out of harmony with love and truth. If I take an action that affects millions of people, then imagine how rapidly my soul condition degrades if that action is out of harmony with love and truth. It's going to degrade very rapidly.
And this is why we find many past leaders, past religious leaders, past in the spirit world who've come to a point of actually having the courage to see what they've created, entered a process of repentance, but now their entire life's work is surrounding correcting the error that they've created on Earth.
Attempting to correct the error on Earth, but they're also trying to correct the error with every single person that's been influenced by those decisions that pass into the spirit world as well. So you can imagine they often have a very large task ahead of them that they feel they feel love about now, but they feel very, very passionate about that task. And they want to address that task before they do anything else that involves their will, generally.
Naturally
so.
Yeah. Okay. So, and the last point. This point overall was about organisation parents or people can actually limit free will and be in harmony with divine truth and divine love. And the 4th point we've kind of covered, which was being a parent is a gift from God to allow parents to become involved in teaching God's children in their care about God's love and truth.
Yes, and this is like the concept of parenthood that needs to change on the planet. You don't own them. You don't own your children. You are a caretaker, a custodian of the children, and only a temporary one at that. And as a result of that, you bear a significant degree of responsibility for what your child is taught in terms of how it utilises its own will.
It reminds me of, it's almost more than a custodian, it's a guardian, it's a teacher. It's similar to our guide and our guardian who are with us constantly.
Yes.
This is almost the role we take with these little beings, isn't it? To help them. They've just arrived and have no concept of themselves as an individual or God or anything. And so, yeah, it's a big task.
Yeah, it's a big task.
Yeah.
And very important to understand free will if we're going to be a parent.
Yeah.
Very important to understand how we limit free will if we're going to be a parent.
Yeah.
Because we're going to need to do both of those things with our children if we're truly going to teach them God's truth.
Yeah. And we're going to have to want to love them so much that we're willing to be humble so that we're not acting in violence towards them all the time.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And remember those acts of violence. You, as a parent, I know many of the parents who are here listening to this discussion, and you think about it as a parent, many of the times in the course of a day you act in violence towards your child under the definition we've given. Does that make sense? So we need to first realise we're doing that, and once we realise we're doing that, we can change it.
Yeah. Okay, so let's talk about the next point, which is that I may limit the will of another without having any negative consequence upon my soul or the other soul of the other, as long as limiting their will is done with 1, the emotion of love being present within myself towards the other.
So let's just write down some of these. So we have to have the emotion of love. Yep.
Inside of myself towards that person.
Inside of myself towards the other. It has to be an actual feeling of love. It can't be oh, I think I love them. It has to be a feeling.
I want to love them.
Yeah. It's not I want to love them either. It's a feeling of love.
Yeah. Okay. And remembering with my example with the snake, that all that took, I'm not free of my fear of snakes, but all of that took was my desiring to own that, and I could feel this fear is in me. I can love that snake.
Exactly. And you look at it then and you can see the beauty of the snake and so forth. And when you get to the point where you just go and pick him up and take him outside or whatever, then you know there's a lot more love coming from you.
Which is what you did. Yeah. Okay. I have the motivation of giving the gift of my love to the other.
All right. So there's the motivation of love. Now, can you see there's love. The love has to exist within you, but there also has to be a motive of giving the gift.
Yeah.
So motive of giving, and you think of that's a gift. You're giving a gift to the other. So that's an important part of this,
Yeah. That I have the motivation of helping and assisting the other soul to grow.
Okay, so we're the motive. So again, it's another motive of causing growth. And most of the time when we try to limit the free will of others, it's with the motive of degrading them as much as we possibly can.
Or preventing them
from growing.
Doing something.
Yeah. And so we need to make sure that that's a part of it.
Yeah. So all this is true as long as the action of limiting their will is still in harmony with God's truth and God's love.
Okay, so it still has to be harmonious with not our own truth, God's truth, and the way God.
Ahí haya añadido irónicamente, armónico no con nuestra propia verdad.
Would express love.
Yeah. And I suppose,
Lo decía aquí. Vale, que no sé qué estaba pensando en ese momento.
Well, let's talk about the points.
I just feel that with all of those things, you see, love is not an emotion that you can easily manufacture. It's not an emotion that you can intellectually generate. You know, a lot of people believe this, and it astounds me sometimes how many religious people believe this, that you can actually generate love in your mind. You can assist the generation of love that comes from your soul by using your mind, certainly.
Yeah.
So I'm not saying that it's not possible, but the feeling has to come out of your heart for it to be present.
Yeah.
So you have to do it with your heart involved. If it's just your mind involved, it's the same as basically very little difference to that and not really acting at all.
Yeah. Okay. So, and I suppose that, like in the other definitions, if I had some of those things, so you're talking about there, if I had none of those things, that would have a consequence. But if I had some of those things, but not all of them, that would be
better.
Different,
That would be much better, of course.
Yeah.
We can't expect ourselves to be perfect when we
Yeah.
begin this process. So all we can do is do with what we are, but we've got to stop using what we are as an excuse.
Yes.
Many people do that with us. Like I often get emails from people saying, I'm angry with you, so they're angry with me, and they say, I know that's wrong, but I just wanted to tell you.
Or I'm doing the best I can with
Or they say, and then they say, you must realise that I'm a work in progress. Well, yes, I do, but you've just justified damaging me even further. And the reality is, a person who has a sincere desire to love doesn't use it as a blind or as an excuse for badness. And so we need to stop making this decision that we have, many of us have, of saying to ourselves, I'm just a work in progress, go easy on me, right? Like, no, all of God's laws are operating on you right now to the full extent. Any moment you're out of harmony.
Esto de no te preocupes por mí creo que se refiere más bien a ten piedad, piedad no es la palabra, o sea, hazlo fácil conmigo, si lo traducimos literal, go easy. O sea, sé suavecito, algo así con...
With those laws.
Como una idea de condescendencia, Iván, o de conmiseración.
Sí, claro, de pedirle conmiseración, algo así, ¿verdad? Pedirle...
Claro.
Exactamente.
Sí, ahora entiendo.
Más o menos.
Because there is an instant reaction in your soul to the disharmony. So why do you want me to act differently to God when God's already doing this with you? And God is the most loving being in the universe, and which is what we all were aspiring to do. So why would we ever justify where we are at currently in order to get away with becoming more loving? So we need to address that.
And it just comes again and again back, doesn't it, to this, once we desire to enter this relationship with God, the potential is so much more, isn't it? Because we really want to view ourselves as God views us and view our actions in the way that God views us. And some of us are punitive on ourselves when God isn't, and some of us let ourselves off the hook when God doesn't.
Exactly.
And so if we really go for this God relationship, that it really helps.
Well, it'll bring us out of all of our unbalances into the balanced position, which is the idea. God doesn't, like you just said, God isn't punishing, angry, nasty to us or any of those things. And God doesn't want us to be angry, nasty to ourselves or any of those kind of things. But God wants us to have a good opinion of ourselves, not a bad opinion of ourselves. But of course, it's very hard to have a good opinion of yourself if you know that you're doing things out of harmony, love all the time, and you're perfectly happy to go ahead and do it. Of course, you're not going to have a very good opinion of yourself after you choose to do that.
Okay, so let's talk about some of the points here.
Some of the limitations here, like some of the notes about it.
Well, some of this is actually just that any action taken in this manner will always bear a positive result for my own soul.
Always.
So
if we look at the effect of our own soul, if I act limiting the will of another person, so this is, remember in context, we're talking about limiting the will of another person. If I act limiting the will of another person because I love them and because I have a motive of giving them a gift and because my motive is causing growth and because I know for certain that my actions are in harmony with God's laws and love and truth, then my own soul will automatically grow through the process. So that's the point that we want to make.
However, if I have error inside of me,
I may still feel some pain doing it. So, for example, an appropriate way of handling a child who comes up and hits somebody is quite simple. Most people don't do it, but it is very, very simple way to restrict the will of a child who's hitting somebody. What you do is you have a feeling of fear, love. You have to have this feeling of love, the motive of giving the child the gift of understanding that the way they've just used their will is out of harmony with love, giving them a motive. You've got a motive of wanting to cause the child to grow, and you know that hitting a person is definitely not God's truth.
Yeah.
So you know that you need to correct something. So what you would do is you would just hold the arms and the legs of the child, and you would just hold it, and at the same time tell it that what it just did was out of harmony with love and truth, and so you...
Vamos a poner un momento.
You are going to restrict it. And you know that hitting a person is definitely not God's truth.
Yeah.
So you know that you need to correct something. So what you would do is you would just hold the arms and the legs of the child, and you would just hold it, and at the same time tell it that what it just did was out of harmony with love and truth, and so you are going to restrict its will. And then you just keep holding it, and keep holding it, and keep holding it, and keep holding it, and keep holding it. 10 minutes later, you're still holding it. 15 minutes later, you're still holding it. What do you think the child's going to do by this stage? The child will be beside itself in rage, most probably, if it's the very first time you've done this with the child.
And it's a long-standing issue for the child.
And it's a long-standing issue for the child. If the child's willing to hit another person, this is a long-standing issue for the child. So you hold. And you hold it, and you hold it. Eventually the child goes into its rage. And it's kicking, screaming, trying to bite you. You still hold it. You're still feeling love for the child. And it's kicking, screaming, carrying on, kicking, screaming, carrying on. And you might have to hold it for an hour and a half like that. But you may have to, if you're a parent with a husband or wife, you may have to take it in shifts initially. Right? And you hold it and hold it and hold it. And eventually it breaks through out of the rage and into real grief. And then instead of holding it like this, you could hold it like this, and just allow the child to go through the grief. All the while reminding the child that the reason why you've done this is because its actions were out of harmony with love.
Has visto la forma restrictiva y nutritiva, eso son palabras para traducir los gestos de primero restringir con los brazos y luego como acunar, que he puesto ahí. Casi de dar el pecho.
And so as a parent, if you have some error within you, what's that experience going to be like?
You'll feel guilty. You'll feel like everybody will be looking at you, and you'll go, and you'll feel like a bad parent, and you'll feel like all sorts of things while the child's screaming and raging bloody murder, as the saying goes. But you will still hold the child if you love them.
And if you love them and you want to maintain this love and give them the gift of growth, then you'll be humble to those feelings as they arise.
Every single one of those feelings.
And so you might be crying with them for part of the time. Then you might be like hot with shame for part of the time. All those things might be happening.
And you know, obviously, if you're in a crowded space, you'd take them to a private place somewhere, but you'd continue holding them, continue holding them, continue holding them. You wouldn't want to impose this rage of the child onto other people, of course. So you'd take them to somewhere that's, you know, where everyone's able to not have to listen to the child in a rage, but you would continue holding them.
Yeah.
Now, with the parents that we've recommended that to do, within 3 days, their children have changed totally in their behaviour.
Yeah.
Within 3 days.
And also that pain that the parent has had in them, if they fully engage this process, would have
starts coming out,
or would begin to lean.
Yeah. Now, in a really strong case, the child may have to do that for 21 days or longer.
Yeah.
So imagine doing that every single time the child takes an action out of harmony with love. Every single time, child, you restrict them. Imagine how much of that time of your how much time of your day that might be taken up doing that. You have to be a really present parent to do that. But
because you can't do it if you're not present either, can you?
no, you can't. As soon as you go away from yourself, you're now out of harmony with love. You're not feeling these emotions towards the child. You're now acting in violence towards the child. You can't do that.
But also, I mean, you're saying it might take 21 days, but it seems to me that if a parent is really stepping up in terms of desire to love, be present, and be present with their child while this is going on, it would have to be very extreme to take 21 days.
Very extreme.
Because that child is also going to now respond. A lot of the reason why this error has entered them is because they didn't feel love coming towards them.
Exactly.
For a long time.
And in a way, the child, if the parent has a feeling of love coming towards the child at the same time, then at least the child will eventually start feeling that mummy and daddy love me here. They're just trying to teach me. They're trying to cause my own growth. And a very young child, 2 years of age, can understand this very rapidly, much more rapidly than the average adult can, actually.
Yeah.
And
well, we get restricted for 5 minutes. It's in the grocery line and we're like...
Yeah, that's right. The average adult gets restricted and then they go into a violent rage, right? Yeah. Which is very hard to control, and you need 5 people to hold them down.
Yeah.
And with a child, it's very different. You can do it, one person. And the younger you do it, obviously, the easier it is.
And I imagine for a lot of children, this would be almost like a time when they feel more connected to their parent than they ever have.
Yes.
Like, here's a parent who's willing to stop everything and
look after this particular teaching point with the child. The other benefit too is that any spirits that the child has due to the unrestricted use of their will. See, often what happens when children are brought up with an unrestricted use of the will, there are a lot of spirits in the spirit world who go, yippee. With an unrestricted use of the will, there are a lot of spirits in the spirit world who go, yippee, we've now got an unrestricted use of our will if we connect to this child and overcloak this child. So they all dive into the child, and the child goes and does this, and next moment he's doing that, next moment there's havoc following him wherever he goes, and it's a full-time job for the mother and father to even tidy up after him, let alone correct them. And this is because of spirit. Influence a lot of time, but if you restrict the will of this child, the spirit's going, hang on a sec, I'm getting restricted from doing what I want as well. So the spirits with them also learn that an unrestricted use of their will is not in harmony with love or truth.
Yeah, and I was just thinking about that child who has a lot of spirits with them. They're not even present then, and so they're not even getting to learn very much or understand themselves as an individual, are they?
That's right.
And if that happens from a very young age, it can be very damaging.
Very
I imagine.
damaging. The
older they get, they're then accustomed to spirit overcloaking. And
this is also why many murderers who are now in jail, many, like 80 to 90% of them, I think it is, say they usually heard a voice telling them to do it or whatever, and they went along with that voice. And this is because many of them were brought up with an unrestricted use of their will. Many of them were brought up by mothers without fathers, and the mothers had no idea how to restrict the child's will, and as a result of that, they're brought up with deep injuries that they can use their will in any direction they see fit, and as a result of that, they then take actions influenced by spirits who also are influencing because they enjoy the fact that the person was brought up with no restriction on their will.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the very, very complex problems can be resolved very simply through our actions in restricting another person's will.
And it's almost like we get this whole understanding of all these other things, and we can understand the intricacies of what's happening spiritually, what's happening. happening emotionally, all of these things. But if we don't understand these key loving use of free will,
Yep.
it still doesn't really mean anything anyway, does it?
Not really, no.
We're not, in terms of our growth.
In terms of our growth, our soul growth is directly dependent upon how we use our will.
Yeah.
If we use our will in a loving, truthful manner, in harmony with God's love and truth, our soul has to grow. It cannot not grow. It's going to grow. If we use our soul in a negative direction, in disharmony with God's love and truth, our soul will degenerate. It cannot not degenerate. It has to degenerate when we use our will in that direction. And so this is why it's so important to understand that the will and how we express it is of supreme importance to the rest of our life, and it's supreme importance to even coming to know who we are and coming self-aware. Yeah.
Sometimes I feel quite emotional just about the simplicity and the beauty of what God's created.
Yeah, it's beautiful.
Yeah, just that if we really live in ourselves, if we desire this awareness and desire to have an awareness of God's love and how that operates, then really everything is laid out ahead of us, and we just have to stay true to those things.
Yeah.
Understand our will, understand God. How's God teaching me? Yeah.
It's very important. Yeah.
Okay.
Voy a poner esta parte última tan importante donde se emociona para ver, distinguir que esto lo ha dicho Miller. Voy a intentar.
God's love.
Beautiful.
Yeah, just that if we about this
and coming self-aware.
Yeah. Sometimes I feel quite emotional just about the simplicity and the beauty of what God's created.
Yeah, it's beautiful.
Yeah, just that if we really live in ourselves, if we desire this awareness and desire to have an awareness of God's love and how that operates, then really everything is laid out ahead of us, and we just have to stay true to those things.
Yeah.
Understand our will, understand God. How's God teaching me? Yeah.
Very important. Yeah.
Okay. So
that was the first point, wasn't it? That
so,
we are allowed to use our will. We may limit the will of other people, use our will to limit the will of other people, as long as we have these underlying motivations and feelings that are coming from our soul.
Yeah, and we talked about how that acting in that way might trigger the pain for the person taking the action, because they might have error, and also it may trigger pain in the person who's having their will restricted.
So like in the little child who's getting his will restricted in this moment, he's screaming his head off and having a great big fit. So, obviously he's feeling some pain, but the pain is not the result of truth. It's a result of the truth confronting the error that's already within him.
Yeah. And the pain will cease once the error has left.
Once the error leaves the child, the pain for the child will cease, and the child will, from that moment on, automatically begin acting in a loving manner.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
And then the last point, if we're thinking then again about the three aspects we've been discussing, so the person taking the action, the person who's limited in their free will, and then the environment. Obviously, these kind of actions to limit will are going to always be positive for the environment.
Always positive for the environment. If we can go back to the parent example too, if you think about it, limiting, a lot of parents worry, well, aren't the parent isn't the child just reflecting my behaviour? Yes, totally. So yes, they are. And if you have to restrict the will of the child during this physical process, you are going to find out why you didn't restrict their will in the past, and therefore confront the emotion that caused you to be so tolerant of their unruly behaviour.
Because often, isn't it, we were talking earlier about the parent who has all the grief about the punitive childhood.
Yeah.
They have anger capping that. And so
Yes.
often the child is expressing that anger of that. As soon as they limit the will of the child, that anger and that sadness is going to get triggered for the parent.
Exactly.
If they really desire
If they're
that.
open to doing it.
Yeah. Okay.
So that's our first point about limiting the free
Limiting
will of
free will.
others, which was all to do with it. Yes, you can, but it has to be under certain circumstances.
So the second one.
Let's add to the circumstances.
Yeah. If I limit the free will of others and take such actions because I believe such actions to be in harmony with God's truth and love, but the actions are not actually in harmony with God's truth and love, then there will be a painful consequence upon my soul and upon the soul of those I'm attempting to limit.
Yes, and the reason why I wanted to discuss this with you is because many people on earth believe they know God's truth on a certain issue, particularly many religious people. They feel they know God's truth on a certain issue, and then they feel they can take an action to limit the will of others based on that. Well, firstly, many of them take a violent action, which is an indication they do not know God's truth on the issue, for a start. But secondly, they impose their own ideas of God's truth on others rather than what is God's truth on others. And we have to be very, very careful that we do not enter this arrogant state.
Yeah.
The arrogant state is when I believe I know God's truth on a matter, but I actually do not. And this is not a very good state for your soul condition, actually.
Yeah.
Because what it will do is it will cause you to take actions believing them to be right, but they are actually wrong, and therefore damaging your own soul. Now, there are many people from religious organizations that have entered the spirit world who thought they would arrive in the spirit world, you know, and be with Jesus in the heavens and so forth. And actually they go to the hells of the spirit world because of this one point. They believe that they can attack other people, have acts of violence towards other people because of a difference in opinion about a truth. And the reason why they believe that is they believe that what they personally believe is God's truth, and they feel that is the justification.
And so is it true then that there's a penalty because of the action, but also because of the arrogance?
There's two penalties. There's the penalty because of the unloving action itself, because the unloving action usually involves an act of violence, but even if it doesn't, it still was usually taken with the wrong motive. And that was a motive of arrogance or judgment towards the other. Remember, a motive of judgment is always an act of violence. So therefore it's taken with the wrong motive. But secondly, it builds their own arrogance. So what it does is that every single time they act thinking they're doing it for God, they're actually building their own arrogance and resistance to truth, which makes it even more difficult for them to come to terms with what is truth.
Yeah.
And so there are many spirits in the spirit world, in the hells of the spirit world, who have yet to recognise what God's truth is, and they still believe that their version of it is the truth.
Yeah.
Yep.
And what about us as students of this path? How do we safeguard against things like this?
Well, we need to be very careful here too, because a real change at the soul level can only occur in the heart. The problem with hearing all of these truths, that many of which have never been presented really on earth in the way that we're presenting them now, the trouble with hearing these truths and actually thinking you understand them is that you then think you get them before you actually get them in your heart. And this is a very dangerous condition, getting something in your head and thinking you've got it before it's actually in your heart. it can only enter your heart when all of the untruth, the opposite belief systems and so forth, leave your heart. And that is a process, as you know, that is involved in something. And this is why even in our own involvement, like with each other, you've had times when we've talked about an issue, and then 3 years later you go, wow, like you've gone through all of these emotions.
Then I run and go, hey, you know that thing? It's like that.
Oh, like you've gone through all of these emotions.
Then I run and go, hey, you know that thing? It's like that thing. And he's like, yeah, I told you. And I'm like, oh, sorry, but I get it now.
Yeah.
Because I get it here.
Because you get it
here.
rather than get it.
Yeah.
And when you get things here, things change rapidly then in your life. So that's another way of measuring, is if something isn't changing very rapidly in your life, then there's a high likelihood that you're not getting it here. So many people are worried about have they met their soulmates and those kind of issues, for as an example.
Mm-hmm.
Well, if your soulmate hasn't been attracted into your life by now, then it means you're not getting it here.
Yeah.
And so you need to come to terms with that. You don't understand the principles that involve attraction of soulmates here. You might think you do, but you don't. Because if you did here, things would change. And it's very, very similar with this particular point, that we need to understand that it's God's viewpoint of the matter that matters. Now, if I don't know God's viewpoint, I am in a very dangerous position if I start limiting the will of others.
And it's not no here, it's no here. Yeah. And like sometimes I reflect upon yourself, because I feel like you're the ultimate student of this path, because you've also engaged it with your soul from the very beginning. So, and for the rest of us, you've taught us a lot of things, and we've engaged it here.
Yes.
From the beginning.
And I can see that as a bit of a problem for most, because for me, I've only been able to engage these truths after I've gone through a process. So I haven't actually, I can write down this stuff about free will and all the laws and principles involved in free will, but they're not coming from my mind. They're coming from a soul that's let go of all of this free will-based damage, or a lot of it at least by now, enough to actually write down the principles without having it to come from my mind.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
And
so therefore it's an automatic process for me to engage in this process. So sometimes people come up to me and I will literally grab them by the shoulders and turn them around and send them off. And I have limited their free will in complete harmony with the feeling that's present as what I've described there.
Yeah.
If another person did exactly the same thing without the same feeling,
that would be violence.
That might be an act of violence.
Yeah. And I think that's why, just on that point about the way you've approached this path, which has always, right from the first century, been about engaging your soul and learning through that process. I think that's why I really loved the last talk you gave at the end of last year, The Way, because it was really teaching all of us that is the way, and this is how we really engage this. Yeah. And it's great to have this as a framework. In fact, it's an immense gift. But unless
it can also
we engage,
be a problem.
Yeah, that's what I see now, and I see that sometimes around us, that unless we engage the soul process, it's all useless and it can become damaging.
Yes,
it can become arrogance, which is why probably I brought up this, how do we safeguard against this arrogance?
Exactly. This is why this is such an important point, because if we do not safeguard against the arrogance in our own process, then what happens is we start imposing our own belief systems upon other people rather than actually limiting people's will based on God's feelings and principles, and based on those primary underlying motivations.
Yeah.
So limiting a person's free will is a dangerous proposition if all of this is just in our head and we think we're acting in harmony with it.
Yeah. And it almost seems like this is not a small thing that we're talking about. This path is not a mild kind of hobby.
Yeah.
It's something that affects everything, about everything we do,
Yeah.
from what we do in every moment of the day.
And not only everything we do, but everything we do that affects other people that they then do.
Yeah. And it's kind of like with knowledge comes responsibility. That's what it feels like to me. And almost sometimes it feels like, unless I'm willing to fully embrace this, it can get dangerous.
Yeah.
Because I'm actually going to try to
it.
apply knowledge that isn't coming, that, I can apply knowledge and engage my soul. I see that now.
Yeah.
I can take what I've learned in my head and use that in an act of faith to engage something into my soul process, and I can grow through the experience.
Yeah.
But if I just engage my head, it's sort of, the soul is going to be doing all kinds of other things, and that's going to affect what happens.
And most of the time we're in denial of what it's doing as well, which is a problem.
Yeah.
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 The beauty of this particular principle is that we need to understand that why I remain humble, I will always be asking myself the question, what would God do here?
Yeah.
Not what would I do here. So quite often what we would do, if somebody treats us badly, quite often what we would do is go, F this, and, carry on about them, and, don't want to see them anymore. Does God do that? Obviously not. So straight away we know we're out of harmony with God's truth.
Yeah.
And then if I try to limit the person's free will while I'm in that space, I know, boy, I'm probably damaging my own soul, and I'm probably going to damage theirs as well. Right?
Yeah.
And it's quite easy for us actually to determine when we're going to damage another person's soul. If we're humble.
Yeah, once our heart's engaged, a lot of this becomes easier. It's the terror that we have of engaging our heart sometimes that limits everything, isn't it?
Yeah, but I feel it's more the humility than even the engaging the heart.
Well, I suppose that's what I mean by humility.
Because if you look at it, if I'm humble in this process, always asking myself, what would God do in these situations? What does God do in these situations? Because God is already acting in a lot of these situations. And if I ask myself these questions, I wouldn't just arrogant. If I'm humble in this process, always asking myself, what would God do in these situations? What does God do in these situations? Because God is already acting.
Aquí dice en realidad, ya sabes, traduce en realidad una frase que dice en coletilla, que es sobra, y es porque Dios hace efectivamente cosas, porque Dios ya está actuando en muchas de esas situaciones. Entonces aquí hay, sí que lo tengo que corregir sí o sí. Y esto es repetir la pregunta, ¿qué hace Dios en estas situaciones? Pero es que Dios, ya está, sí.
In a lot of these situations, and if I ask myself these questions, I wouldn't just arrogantly assume that my current belief is God's belief on the situation. I would never arrogantly assume that, and I, in particular, would not arrogantly assume that if I did act in one example and I found there was a negative result, I would certainly not go to the second time and do the same thing again if I was humble. Yeah. And so this is the problem that many religions on the planet have, is they act in a form of arrogance about their understanding of truth, and unfortunately their arrogance is actually their own worst enemy.
Yeah.
And it actually rapidly degrades their own condition beyond that point, and sometimes beyond the point where they can be redeemed very easily at all. And usually there's now a long process of self-discovery that has to occur before they'll even be redeemed from their unloving actions.
Which, sadly, I kind of feel as a human race at the moment, we're all in a high state of arrogance, aren't we? There's going to be a lot of self-reflection that's needed. Because we've acted in self-reliance for such a long time.
Yeah. And this is what I like about you doing a book study group at the moment, because what it does is it helps everybody who engages that process sincerely to actually be far more self-reflective. And self-reflective is a part of being self-aware.
Yeah.
And once we're self-aware, we can use our will in harmony with love much more easily if we're aware of what's in our soul and coming out of it at all times.
Yeah, yeah. Thanks, Maggie. Okay, so we're still on the points of, you know, when I believe my actions are in harmony with truth and love, and they're not.
And they're not.
So we said that'll be harmful to my soul for the two reasons. And then any action taken in this manner will also be harmful to the soul of others affected or involved in the action.
Definitely.
And cause their souls to degenerate.
Well, you imagine you're imposing untruth, which you believe as truth, upon them. And there's a chance that they will either receive it as truth and then act in the same way you are, which is a terrible thing that they could do with what's being perpetrated towards them, or there's a chance they'll go into violence themselves and repel. And either way, they're now out of harmony. They're harming the soul. Yeah,
and that's what you've said here. It will bear a painful consequence upon their soul, whether they are conscious of the immediate pain at the time or not, and whether they desire the person to take that action because of their addictions.
Exactly. So sometimes people want you to take an action that is out of harmony with love because of their own addictions.
Yeah.
They want you desperately to do things. So, for example, a lot of people want you to desperately tell them that they're a nice person, right? Just because they don't feel they are inside of themselves yet. They want you to say it to them, and to feed them with that addiction would not necessarily be a loving act, and therefore could be quite damaging to them.
If we talk about it in terms of limiting my will, though, what would that be like? Would that be like...
In what regard?
Well, why would I addictively want you to limit my will?
In terms of limiting will, like a lot of people, here's an example. A lot of people come up to me and say, what are my passions? I go with that question. Yeah, it's an interesting question, that. While I might know what your passions are, you're actually asking me to limit your will.
Yeah.
Because part of your will needs to be engaged in finding them for yourself.
Yeah.
So you're actually asking me to help you limit your own will.
It's almost like, hi, I'm Mary. Can you tell me who I am?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Can you tell me
and we
what
often
to do?
get that as well. And we often get, can you tell me what my desires are? Interesting, yes.
Yeah.
Any desire you would like to have in the universe are yours.
Yeah. Still goes back to you, what you want. Yeah.
And what do you want? And the problem is that many people want you to limit their will for a lot of reasons that are based upon fear.
Yeah.
They don't want to engage their own will because they're afraid if they do, they might go in the wrong direction and therefore, have negative consequences. So that's all about me wanting me to create this feeling inside of them that they'll have someone to blame if they do what I say.
Yeah. There's the addiction.
And there's the addiction. They don't want to take personal responsibility for their own life. They want somebody else to take responsibility for their own life. And if I fall into the pattern of feeding that, then I'm falling into the pattern of helping them avoid their own responsibilities.
Yeah. Okay. So when
it would be much more loving for me to say, sorry, you're helping me, you're wanting me to help you avoid your own responsibilities. It would be much more loving for me to say that. If I knew that to be true, of course. And then it would be for me to engage the addiction.
Yeah. Beautiful, thank you. So this is when we're limiting free will and we're not in harmony with God's truth and God's love. It will also be potentially painful to the physical and spiritual bodies of the person we're restricting.
Yes.
And this will happen unless their soul is at one with God.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. So let's say I'm a member of a police force.
Yeah.
and I've learnt what an act of violence is,
Yeah.
then I could still use a gun to shoot a person.
How would that work?
Now that went down like a lead balloon for our audience. Well, I could have a thing called a taser gun, which immobilises a person, and I could use that gun with a feeling of love, with a motive of giving, a motive of causing growth, and in harmony with God's love and God's truth, and without any personal fear, I could use that gun to shoot the person and immobilise them so that I can stop them from taking action which would harm others.
Yeah.
And I could perfectly do that in perfect harmony with all of God's laws.
Now that to me seems completely logical and rational and loving. I guess the issue I feel that society has now is that they kid themselves that they do these things with these kind of motivations when really there's a lot of fear, there's a lot of arrogance, there's a lot of wanting to punish, anger, and I suppose God's seeing all of that anyway.
Well, all of God's laws automatically go to correct those things, and obviously the degradation of the soul is all based upon God's laws being the reaping of what you've sown.
Yeah.
And so we don't need to worry too much about it. We need to just understand the process, but we need to understand that we can actually limit a person's free will by what might be classified today as an act of violence, which is not an act of violence.
Yeah.
An act of violence is the definition we've given, which is all about the motive and motivation coming from the heart.
Yeah.
So do you think you would ever shoot the guy in the head with a bullet
No.
if you were trying to, do it in harmony with God's love?
Well,
of
you'd
course
be
not.
trying to take life, which is one of the biggest
Exactly.
gifts. Yeah.
And you wouldn't be aiming at his head, would you?
No.
If you had a totally different motive.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, and then the third point on that was just that when we limit people's actions and we're not in harmony with God's will and God's love, then it's also going to be harmful to the whole environment.
Yeah.
And even you drew the example of affecting how animals treat one another.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so
animals, insects, everything in the environment is acting towards other living creatures based on our own feelings.
Yeah.
So even the way insects attack different trees is all based on our own feelings. It's all, the trees often that insects attack are the ones we love the most.
Yeah.
There's all sorts of partialities that we have that
reflect our own partiality in terms of God's creation.
That's right. Right.
Yeah.
And as a result of that, the environment is perfectly reflecting everything that we do that's out of harmony with the proper use of will.
Yeah. Beautiful.
Yeah.
Okay, well, we've only got a couple more points to cover.
No worries.
So, second last one. If I limit the free will of others, and take such actions without having a feeling of love that is in harmony with divine truth, with divine love for the individuals that I'm attempting to limit, then there will be a painful consequence upon my soul and upon the soul of those I'm attempting to limit.
Yes.
So we've covered this in a little way, but let's talk about some of the finer points. So the feeling or emotion of love must be in harmony with the way God would express love and not based upon my own definition of love.
Yes, this is a tricky issue for many people because a lot of times people are feeling guilt when they say they're feeling love.
Yeah.
And so, guilt is a fear-based emotion. It's not a love-based emotion. And so oftentimes they assume that they feel love towards a certain person. But in reality, a lot of times the emotion they're feeling is not anything to do with love.
Yeah, and I was talking to the girls this morning about how sometimes when a partner has taken away all of my fear, I've felt what I believe to be a huge feeling of love for them, which was, now I know it's just a total addiction being met feeling. But I could have sworn it's
nice
love.
for another person to take away my fears.
Yeah.
And you feel like you're free of fear and so you can love them. But the reality is the fear is still inside of you and the other person's just addictively feeding your demand of taking away fear. So that's not an act of love.
Yeah.
And we've got to go by God's definition of love not by our own. So there has to be an actual feeling of love as God would define love to be coming from our soul if we're going to limit the free will of another person without damaging our soul.
Okay. And when we do this, we're going to cause negative consequences for our soul. And we're going to cause harm to the soul affected by our action.
Yes.
And that will cause their soul to degenerate, similar to the way you previously expressed.
Yes.
And same thing, it will be immediate. They will have pain, whether they feel it immediately or later, because it's delayed by addictive things.
Exactly. And even they will have pain, even if right at the moment they have pleasure from your action. So they would have pleasure from your action if you fed their addiction, but it actually degrade their soul and therefore cause more pain later. Feeding another person's addiction always causes more long-term pain and suffering.
And lastly, of course, it's going to be harmful to the environment again.
Of course. So you can see how the underlying principle of my soul, other person's soul, environment is pervades every principle involved with the
free will,
use of will. And that's understandable when you think about it. When you look at the use of will, we can use our will in any way. In any way right across the board. And so if we can use it in any way right across the board, it makes sense that we're going to have an effect on ourselves, other people, and the environment right across the board whenever we do something.
Definitely.
And a lot of times these effects multiply. So I've affected your will, then you made choices based on the effect of how I've affected you. You then go and affect somebody else. They then made choices from your will and so forth. And I bear a degree of responsibility for every one of those courses of action. Now you think about it in a positive direction. I let you know the truth about how to use your will, and I affect your will in a positive direction. You then affect somebody else's will in a positive direction. I bear some of the pleasure of the fact
the reward
of the fact that they have used their will in a positive direction, because that also came from, in a roundabout way, from myself.
So you're going to reap what you sow.
So you're going to reap what you sow in a positive direction as well as a negative one. Too many of us are going, I will reap what I sow, I will reap what I sow, I will reap what I sow. This all sounds very, very different. And bad. And the reality is we could be reaping what we sow in a good way. Like, I'm sure when you sow a lettuce and a lettuce grows up, you don't go, oh, this is terrible, I've got to,
sell it for dinner.
You go, you beauty, a lettuce come up. That's what I planted. That's what I expected to come up, And we're using our will, just planting the lettuce. We've sown something. We've used our will to look after it. It's grown into something that we can utilise, and we receive joy from that. And we need to understand that when we use our will in a positive direction, we cannot but help to have joyous results from the use of our will in that direction.
And it's interesting because we talked about the parable of the talents in book group this week, and quite a few people had a lot of fear about feeling like, I've got to use what I've been given, I've got to act, I've got to do things, because there's all this fear in us, when actually we see that if we use our will in harmony with love and are humble to the fear, it's only going to work out better than where we were.
So in the parable of the talents, for example, the guy who got 10 would have gone, you beauty, I've got 10. I can work with that, I've got a lot, and the guy who got 1 says, you beauty, I've got 1, I can turn that into 2, I can do things with that. And this is what the attitude we need to have about our use of our will. Instead of hearing all this material and going like, it's just so heavy, and now every single day it's like hundreds of times I've committed acts of violence, and instead of going into this terrible shut down place where you now go, so what you decide to do in that place generally is you'll sit home in a fetal position, hoping that somebody else will feed you, water you, and so forth, just so that you can act.
But hang on, was that hope an act of violence?
Exactly. But when you realise there's this whole positive aspect to what we're discussing today, which is, wow, if I use my will in a harmonious and positive manner, I can have an awesome life and create so many powerful things that will come back to me as joy, enjoy, and reap these beautiful rewards of taking these actions that God has automatically built into the system, actually.
Yeah.
All these rewards. So instead of looking at it from a perspective of fear, I don't want to act, and become so afraid, and we're sitting home in this fetal position thinking, I wish I'd never be told the truth. I wish AJ was never in my life and I never heard the truth before. The reason why we feel that way is because we're not prepared to see the positive side of the usage of all of these particular principles. If we could see the positive side and we actually engage the positive side of it most of our life, we would be constantly receiving the rewards of that, and so therefore not stressed out about what all of these principles mean.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And further to that, I feel God loves us. God really loves us. And he has given us this gift of free will. He's given us the gift of self-awareness. He reckons we can handle it.
Exactly. Exactly.
He has faith in us that we can do this great things. He built in the potential in us for great things with those gifts.
Yes.
And so it's only, he believes in us, and if we trust that he really loves us, and everything that we're hearing this afternoon is that he sees our heart, he sees our intention, he always sees that above anything else.
And isn't that fantastic?
That is the best thing, because if we really work on our heart and our intention in the knowledge that God reckons I can handle this, then we're going to launch into something pretty beautiful, actually, aren't we?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I just feel how a lot of people are so afraid of their hearts being seen now.
Yeah.
It's like, most people have this big facades covering over, they have layers of facade over facade, right, and covering over their heart. Yeah. And the reason why, you can see the reason why most people do that, because when they were young, of course, their hearts weren't very much considered generally. And as a result of that, the only consideration was what was coming out of their mind, in terms of their words, and what was also their actions. But there was no consideration of motivation even, and quite often we were punished when we were young for having a pure motivation, but something that finished up destroying something of our parents or something like that, and then feeling lots of rage and anger and so forth from different ones. So my feelings is if we address this negative viewpoint we have of finding out truth, this is a problem in our life. We find out more truth and then we go, oh, now I feel heavier. When actually finding out the truth should create more lightness if we had the attitude that we need to have. Yeah. And the attitude we need to have is we can live in love. Yeah. We can live in harmony with these principles of free will every single moment of our life. And in fact, why wouldn't you want to?
And I don't believe God would have given us these gifts if he didn't think we could.
Exactly.
So, it comes down to how much I really honour God in that space, I feel.
Yeah, very much so.
Yeah. Okay, let's get on to our last point.
Yeah.
So this is just about organisations. If I'm involved in an organisation, institution or group that limits the use of free will of others, I can remain in harmony with divine love and divine truth as long as the organisation itself remains in harmony with divine love and divine truth.
Yes, so this is a very important point. Let's say we become a member of an organisation of any type. And some of the people here are members of the God's Way of Love organisation. So let's use that as an example.
En realidad, queda muy mal llamar la manera de Dios, pero cuando incluyen la palabra amor, la mejor traducción seguramente es la manera de Dios del amor, la organización de la manera de Dios de amar, o de la manera de Dios.
While the God's Way of Love organisation remains as an organisation doing things in harmony with love and truth in the manner we've described so far with regard to its free will, so organisations have the ability to use the collective free will of each individual in the organisation. While that remains in harmony with love and truth, then I remain in harmony with love and truth when I'm a member of it, acting in the same manner. But
this is interesting.
if I myself act out of harmony with the way the organisation acts, then I will actually bear the penalty or the consequence in my soul of those unloving actions that I take. That's number one. And then number two, if the organisation takes actions that are out of harmony with love, and I do not take action to correct it, I am automatically also out of harmony with love.
So this is where it's always about our own soul. So even if the organisation is acting in harmony with divine truth and divine love and using their will in that way, and I'm following along, enacting some of that will, but my heart is dead towards this issue in terms of love and the motive of giving and these things, then God sees that and there's a consequence on my soul.
Yes.
And all, yeah, sorry.
So if I can give an example, let's say in the organisation we have an environment team. In the environment team, sometimes we have to dig up different plants to plant other plants in its place. If I have a feeling, I don't have a feeling, I'm in the environment team, but I don't have a feeling of love towards the plant that I'm digging up, I am actually committing now an act of violence that's damaging my soul. Even though the organisation has asked me to do it, the organisation and the people who are leading the organisation might have an act of love towards it, and so therefore it doesn't damage their soul, but it will damage mine. And so this is where we have to be focused on ourselves and our own feelings about what's happening at any point in time.
And equally, the other point you shared about how even if the organisation is saying we're in harmony with God's love, we're in harmony with God's truth, this is how we're using our will, but I as an individual within that organisation go, hang on, I don't feel that, then I have a responsibility to speak up about that or to use my will
to leave. Yes.
Because equally there's going to be, I can't just rest in the organisation and say, oh, well, the organisation's got it all figured out, I'll just follow along. Because it's God's desiring this self-awareness in me, this self-responsibility, so there'll still be a consequence.
That's right. So you can see that inaction is actually not an option. In almost all the cases we've given, inaction is not an option. And this is where a lot of people like to remain ignorant, and they like to remain ignorant, and it's chosen ignorance. And in fact, there is an area of the hells in the spirit world for people who have chosen ignorance and chosen inaction.
We've been talking about this in book group as well. I call it willful ignorance.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And willful ignorance and willful inaction is actually also out of harmony with love, because the only reason why a person would take willful ignorance or a position of willful ignorance or willful inaction is either because they're angry or they're afraid, and both are acts of violence. So in the end, they're both out of harmony with love.
Very powerful. Okay, well, that's just about the end. We ended on the point that limiting another's free will in harmony with divine love and divine truth cannot involve an act of violence towards oneself, the person being limited, nor the environment.
Right. So this is the flip side of acting in harmony with your free will. When you act in harmony with your free will, it can't involve an act of violence. And if you limit a person's free will, it can't involve an act of violence either. And these are very, very important points that we need to understand. So I feel part of the crux of this discussion, in a way, is our coming to understand what an act of violence actually is at the soul level. Because once we understand at the soul level, we won't be able to perpetrate such violence towards others in any way or in any action we take.
And I suppose we've been given a lot of definitions of that we can intellectually perceive about what an act of violence is. And now it's a matter of sensitizing our soul again, our awareness again, to when we're acting in violence. So in conclusion for this discussion, for this part of the discussion, the next part of the discussion we'll look at more practical examples of how each of these principles apply to practical situations. And many in the audience by now, you probably have quite a number of questions that you might have asked, and what we would like to ask you to do is to put those questions in during the break up the back where the computer is.
Está hablando de la logística para que la gente haga las preguntas mañana, tienen que escribirlas y tal y tal. Sí.
We'll be up there typing in those questions, and if you put your name on the question so that if we need any clarification as to who it came from, we can find you again. And tomorrow, if you're present tomorrow, what we'll try to do is answer many of those questions. But one thing we do want to address tomorrow is how these principles affect every aspect of our life and every aspect of society as well. And so many of the questions that people will possibly ask will be about their own personal lives, but what we also want to ask is questions about society. How would society look if each person in society was acting in harmony with these underlying principles of love that govern the use of our will?
Yeah, so if you think about, for each of you, if you think about the jobs that you've held in your life, the different organisations you've been a part of, systems.
Like the economic system, political system.
Aquí ahora Mary se pone a hablar, que no está en la transcripción, pues eso, como que tenéis diferentes trabajos, no sé qué, no sé cuántos, y dice Miller, pues los sistemas, y luego los sistemas económicos, políticos, no sé qué.
Religious system, education system, medical systems, and all those systems.
And if you reflect on how does this stuff impact on those things,
y si reflexionáis cómo todo este tema que estamos viendo impacta en esas cosas,
we'd love to hear your questions.
Yeah. Nos encantaría escuchar vuestras preguntas.
Around that.
Because the reality is the principles of free will and the gift of free will that each of us have individually been given hugely affects every single thing around us to such a degree that if we all change the way we used our will only, every one of these organisations would have to change and become more harmonious with love if we became more harmonious with love with the way we use our will individually. So this is why it's impossible to force a change upon an organisation that we ourselves have yet to embrace individually.
Yeah.
If we use our will and embrace the principles of truth and love inside of ourselves, now we have the potential of affecting organisations that we belong to or people that surround us or groups that we're in quite easily and simply just by living the principles of free will in the day-to-day life and using love as the underlying basis in the way we use that will.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
So we'd like to thank you guys for listening in on our conversation there with each other. And hopefully that's given you a bit more of a closer understanding of the principles regarding the gift that you have been given of free will. Many of you would probably be surprised at some of the things we discussed today. And I feel some of you are quite happy about some of those things that we've discussed today because they will help you in your day-to-day life to be able to engage your free will even further and also help in terms of affecting other people in their engagement of their own free will as well. And what we're going to do now is have a break for about, what's the time, by the way?
Del tiempo, la hora, y que
4 o'clock. We'll have a break for around, shall we make it half? Because we have a bit of surprise afterwards we'd like to give to you as well.
Porque tenemos también un poco una sorpresa que nos gustaría daros después. Supongo que es música o algo así que suelen poner ahí.
So if we can come back about 4:45 and the surprise might last about an hour or so. So we'll see how we go with the surprise. But thank you for your time today.
Thanks, everyone.
And thank you for your donations. By the way, we will be back here tomorrow at 1 o'clock. And the first part of the discussion tomorrow again will be about this subject, the second part of this subject. Thank you.
Bueno, pues, ¿qué tal? ¿Estamos vivos? Ya nos hemos dado una paliza hoy.
Sí.
He grabado el otro también. Aquí con el ratón.
Sí, me costó sostener la atención. Fui por un café justo hace un ratito.
Sí.
Me quedaron muchas cosas. La verdad es que, así como decías, al finalizar del otro da para recorrer punto por punto una vez que ya ofrecimos a
Sí.
nuestro amado público la lectura silenciosa.
Hay que recorrerlo. Pero bien
Sí.
recorrido.
Sí, tiene muchas aristas, muchas, y wow, sí,
Sí.
movilizante. Como confronta, porque realmente llega un momento en que me detendría a leer una parte y a volver a leerla porque no, claro,
Sí, son
así de
muchas
seguido.
cosas. Sí, está condensado. Y pero tienes algo así en concreto. Yo se me quedó de antes, en el anterior del acto de violencia, cuando es imaginario, ¿te acuerdas que decía que puede degradar más cuando
Claro,
ni
sí.
siquiera hay motivos, ¿no?
Violencia preventiva, algo así, dijo, ¿sí?
Sí, y que también pues por la calle, las personas que han sido pues robadas a lo mejor por una persona de otro país, aquí ocurre mucho, ¿no? En Europa y que hay tanta variedad y que en Argentina tenéis menos, o las personas que han sido violadas, pues ya ven a los hombres de otra manera, son mujeres normalmente, y ven a los hombres, pues esa violencia preventiva como que era, pero qué curioso que decía que era más degradante todavía, y se me ha ocurrido, que se me olvidó comentarlo, la violencia preventiva que se nos ha forzado con estos medios de comunicación asesinos a tener miedo de los demás, ¿no? Que es automáticamente y es imaginario por completo, ¿no? Que el otro me puede matar con sus supuestos virus y es que es espeluznante el apocalipsis por un lado, ¿no? Pero claro, ahora hay que amar el sistema, que ahora se le pone muy difícil la cosa, ¿no? Porque no podemos cambiarlo, sino cosa que hablan al final precisamente, como solamente adquiriendo el cambio dentro podemos, lo que siempre se dice, ¿no? Sé el cambio que quieres ver en el mundo y todo eso, pero ¿qué profundidad adquiere eso en vista de lo poco que llevamos integrado en estas visualizaciones, verdad? Y desde el tiempo que lo llevamos conociendo, que no es casi mucho para nada. ¿Pero qué me dices de ese
Claro.
tema, las mascarillas y de...
Sí, sí, acá, así como allá, puede estar dado por el hecho de que son los inmigrantes, por acá en esta región, con los diferentes niveles económicos, generalmente los más pudientes respecto de los menos. Ese es el miedo en cuestión general, así de base cultural, por decirte.
Sí,
Acá, a diferencia por ahí, bueno, de lo que están viviendo, hablo ahí en España, en Europa, España puntualmente, no sé Portugal, pero España, lo que suelo ver, y claro que de los inmigrantes es otra la cuestión acá. De por sí igual está
bueno,
relacionado de alguna
hay,
manera.
aquí también hay pues junkies o gente en muchos barrios por donde hay mucha más gente con mala pinta, que se dice aquí. Digo,
Sí, exactamente, acá es
es
así todo el
España.
tiempo como muy naturalizado, como ya todo, incluso desde la logística de salir de tu casa,
Está todo enfocado.
por ejemplo, con los monederos, o sea, yo ya no uso cartera, desde una vez que me robaron una mochila, ya no la uso, pero es como un estado de alerta permanente. Claro, proyectarlo a un ser vivo es distinto, pero digo, como que ya hay una predisposición, es una constante, ya se transforma en un estilo de vida prácticamente.
Es una cascada, ¿no? Yo creo que
Sí.
lo que estáis notando allí, que seguramente venga aquí también en algún grado, es el efecto dominó de muchas de esas proyecciones en todas las almas que han vivido ahí durante muchos años.
Y bueno, yo lo experimentaba ayer, Iván, que fui a una escuela y que mi garganta terminó bastante, bueno, justamente sabemos ahora cómo actúa la ley de compensación y que este carraspeo que tengo, así como desgastado, fue por hablar debajo del barbijo, siendo ya que, bueno, acá el presidente dijo que supuestamente ya no era obligatorio, pero la gente no se lo quita y las escuelas menos. Sería una insurrección prácticamente. Además, creo que cada jurisdicción toma su propia decisión, o sea, tiene autonomía respecto de la nación. Así que también creo que acá no se ha expedido el gobernador de la provincia, por lo tanto, no creo que sea libre aquí en el Chaco, por lo menos. Pero como ese desgaste, el esfuerzo, o sea, todo desamoroso, esa desarmonía, se percibe después en el cuerpo, en el mismo esfuerzo de los chicos de mantenerlo arriba, cuando ellos pueden, tratan, se lo sacan, se lo bajan, porque la verdad es que es bastante difícil, muy difícil hacer la tarea así, enmascarillado. Y el miedo, también pudimos ver en otras escuelas que recorrí el miedo, que cierran las aulas, cuando hay un caso se enojan, proyectan hacia afuera, que el gobierno que organizó esa fiesta que en algún momento compartimos con vos y comentamos, ese evento, por la fiesta del estudiante y la primavera. Bueno, claro, ahora se ven las consecuencias, entre comillas, más para la gente, como decíamos siempre, o sea, el miedo crea miedo, es
O
lo
sea,
que crea.
lo achacan a ese evento, las enfermedades.
Sí, exacto.
Sí, sí, es que ahora basta con que tosa alguien, lo que antes era normal, un estornudo, una tos, ahora ya es motivo
Es una
de
amenaza,
apocalipsis, prácticamente.
sí, claro. Y un poco esto que tan bonito cuando vuelve nuevamente a recordarnos la capacidad que tenemos, y que realmente es así, o sea, es la capacidad que tenemos, que es lo que somos, y entonces de nosotros mismos, para con nosotros mismos, ser capaces de negarnos esa oportunidad, ¿no? Porque no hay nada que no podamos procesar, es así, es todo un invento, es toda una fachada, total.
Sí. Bueno, pues nada, muy impactante este taller.
Buenísimo, y me gustaría, si podemos compartirlo nuevamente, como con un punteo, así sea nosotros, y después poder ofrecer algo más reducido,
Sí,
pero me gustaría mucho recorrerlo, porque aparte en grupo es súper guay, diría.
sí,
Sí.
sí, estaría muy bien el leerlo, tener tiempo. Falta muchísimo tiempo y no sé si la gente va este
Y
fin de semana.
todos, te digo que de todos, porque venimos hablando mucho del libre albedrío, entre comillas, siempre está relacionado con todo. Y anoté acá, sí, mientras escuchaba lo de Alice, la importancia, bueno, reconoce un poco a Alice esto de no haber intervenido, o sea, de no haber eh, restringido la voluntad en determinado momento a lo que genera. Anoté varias cuestiones, pero se abre mucho. Pero lo que quería decir era que de todos los que vi, siento que el que más me desafía en este momento a mí es este. Es como que era como que necesitaba sacudir la cabeza y volver a mirar, porque, bueno, aparte también tiene que ver con que ya hicimos una lectura anterior y el momento que estoy atravesando, pero respecto de
Sí, lo que pasa es
incluso,
que es
¿no?
una posición muy, muy tensa, ¿no? Lo que de repente en estas vidas llenos de heridas nos damos de frente con todos, en un grado o en otro, con, ostras, todo lo que hemos hecho y nos hemos enterado como padres, como profesores, o sea, es que es como hay mucho para sentir en este taller con respecto a tu vida y a...
Exacto. Para sentir con el objetivo que decíamos, que bien lo recalcan ellos, ¿no? Para sentir con el objetivo justamente de progresar y de crecer en amor, que sí o sí hay que atravesar. Bueno, como decías al principio, ¿estabas grabando ya? No, no estábamos grabando. Cuando hablaste de la ley de compensación y pasar a la ley de perdón y el arrepentimiento, que obra a partir del deseo de sentir. Entonces, claro, sí, ese sentir, no la culpa, como bien lo deja claro él con el gesto que hace, así, oh, no, todo lo que hice mal, pero sí con la intención de progresar, claro. Y que el privilegio, Iván, de cuando me despierto y pese a que estoy resistiéndome, porque el agotamiento y el aburrimiento son indicadores de resistencia también. Entonces reconozco que mi cansancio con el que terminé particularmente ayer y con el que me levanto a veces
Pero
cuando no descanso.
levantarte que no te permites escribir lo que decías o...
Claro. Sí, sí, y ese despejado, ¿no? Ese levantarte despejado, digamos, propio de una reparación o de un descanso realmente como armonioso, por decirte, como que ya me levanto por ahí con la pesadez, pero recuerdo en los momentos que me vuelvo a conectar, digamos que, claro, que salgo un poquito de la inercia. Me recuerdo el regalo de estar aquí, que es lo que todavía estar aquí, y él lo reconoce en muchas oportunidades, de tener el contacto, estar aquí en la tierra, digo, en este plano, para poder vivirlo desde este lugar. Digamos. Así que sí, también eso agradezco. Por ejemplo, estas oportunidades, compartir con vos, con el grupo y asimismo con mi experiencia que hago en el canal, que es basada en el error y como él dice, totalmente aclarando de que todavía me queda mucho por procesar en
Sí,
este sentido, pero del deseo de compartir para que cada uno, la onda expansiva que él hablaba lo último, ¿no? Así también viene, ¿no? Para abrir, a ver, por ahí alguien capaz le resuena y empieza su propio camino y eso, que es todo lo que puedo hacer, porque obviamente se comprende que aquí es de alma a alma, ¿no? Con Dios, digamos, no hay intermediarios.
Sí, sobre todo es que tenemos que centrarnos mucho más en este tipo de cosas de uno mismo, por ejemplo, relativo a la arrogancia que ha advertido al final en el taller esta hora mucho, para que no caigamos, ¿no? Porque son verdades muy gordas, muy grosas, decís allí, ¿no? En plan italiano, muy simples. No sé
Sí,
si
sí.
me ha salido casi el italiano argentino. Bueno, y inconsciente, debe ser que tengo un espíritu aquí que me está de vuestro que ha venido. Bueno, que
yo ya tengo tus términos también.
sí, estamos aprendiendo. O sea, que es tremendo. Claro, nos pensamos que sabemos algo y
Claro.
eso, la arrogancia. Bueno, pues estamos así ya bastante. Hoy llevamos mucho y muchas gracias por abrir el espacio. Así estamos así. Bueno, yo he notado, creo, cuando te has ido. Yo ha habido momentos ya que también que me desconectaba más porque hoy hemos grabado otro. Y agradece de todas maneras a tu amado público, aunque les hayas abandonado por un café durante.
Sí, totalmente. Agradecida, estoy agradecida. Y a los que llegan hasta acá, como siempre decimos, con más razón.
Sí, y a los espíritus buenos o malos o regulares que hayan estado hablando. Es decir, buenos o malos quiere decir que quieran estar más o menos en desarmonía, que nosotros también somos medio regulares o malos. Y nada, pues feliz Navidad y próspero año nuevo. Lo dejo ya de grabar.
Bueno,